Lovely to see you this morning, Mr. Abbott. Thanks so much for joining me on what has been a pretty monumentous week for global affairs. First of all, what's your interpretation of what Trump has said about Ukraine following his calls with both Zelensky and Putin?
It's still not clear really what's going to happen. And I think it's a little disappointing that the Ukrainians have been cut out of this discussion about their future. Nevertheless, if what comes out of this is a situation which ends the war on the basis of meaningful security guarantees for Ukraine, that might be, in the real world, not a bad outcome. But a meaningful security guarantee for Ukraine has got to mean serious Western troops on the ground in Ukraine, so that if Putin's aggression ever begins again, he won't just be fighting the Ukrainians, he will be fighting serious military powers. So frankly, I think that if there were 10,000 British troops and 10,000 French troops in Ukraine as a kind of a latter-day version of the British Army of the Rhine, that could end up being the most successful outcome and give Ukraine a real chance of flourishing as an independent, sovereign country that can determine its own destiny.
OK, so when Zelensky has called for that so-called European army, you support that, although you appreciate that we haven't got that many troops for ourselves, Mr. Abbott. Well, you know, we've got the smallest army now since the Napoleonic Wars, down to 70,000 troops.
Look, I take that point, and what we've seen in the West over the last decade or so is unilateral military, economic and even cultural disarmament. And one of the things where Trump is dead right is that the countries of the West, America's allies, do need to do more, because for too long all of us have been free riding on the strength of America. Now, I think that, I personally, I'm not a great European integrationist. I don't know about a European army. But the British Army is a very serious army, even though it's too small. The French Army, I think, is a reasonably serious army. If there was a serious British and French presence in Ukraine, both Britain and France are nuclear powers, I don't believe that Putin would risk a fight with Britain and France. And I think that would be more than enough to keep Ukraine safe.
Our defence spending for GDP is 2.3%. What should it be feasibly? I mean, David Lammy's spoken about the Cold War when it was 7%. That's probably not realistic. There's not probably political capital in it necessarily. It's not the top of the list of priorities of the British people. The NHS and immigration come far higher. I mean, what sort of figure should we now be looking at in light of Trump's second presidency?
Well, more than what is currently the case, but in the end, Camilla, you need the military that you need. And rather than say, well, here's a pot of money and that's what we'll spend, you should say, well, what do we want our armed forces to be able to do? And having worked out what you think is the minimum military capability that you need, you then pay whatever needs to be paid for it. And so in my own country, for instance, we need to think about things like offensive and defensive missile defences. We need to think about things like strategic strike. They're obviously very expensive, and that's why Australia, as well as Britain, needs to be spending well north of the current barely 2% of GDP on defence.
Just as a little segue, because I asked Jonathan Reynolds about it, do you have a view on this Chagos Islands giveaway? Because the idea of spending £18 billion on it and then having a massive black hole in the defence budget seems to me to be rather contradictory.
Why do you have to buy what you've already got?
I don't know.
I mean, if you already own it, why do you have to buy it? And this is an absurd situation. I mean, Diego Garcia has been unquestionably British territory. In fact, back in the 1960s, Britain paid £3 million to the Mauritians to secure forever this territory. It belongs to Britain. And just because there was a non-binding opinion from an international court some years ago doesn't mean that Britain now has to pay upwards of £10 billion to keep what it's always had.
Also, we found out that one of the officials ruling on that judgment in the court was linked to the Chinese Communist Party. Oh, what a coincidence, Mr. Abbott.
Well, Camilla, this is the problem. I mean, in countries like Britain and Australia, we think of international courts as if they are the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council.
Yes.
They are not courts of justice. They are courts of politics, often courts of politics driven by aggressive dictatorships
Yes.
with a hatred of the West. And we should be determined to do justice. We should be determined to be decent. But that doesn't mean we should be the slaves of these global tribunals.
Yes. On Trump in general, what do you make of his first month in office?
He's a force of nature. It's probably been the most spectacularly active start to any presidency ever. I think his instincts are fundamentally sound. I think his determination to eliminate the politics of climate and identity is absolutely right. I think he's been pretty brutal in his handling of some of America's friends and neighbours. But if the roughhouse tactics are designed to bring about a good objective and they succeed in bringing about a good objective, well, I suppose perhaps there's something to be said for them.
Do you think it's all about the art of the deal and negotiation, take people to a point of extremity in a bid to reel them back in and get what you want? 25% tariffs on Mexico and China, for instance.
Well, it was 25% tariffs on Mexico and only 10% tariffs on China.
Yeah.
And given that in the end, China is the great strategic competitor, Mexico and Canada are not. I mean, Canada is one of America's closest friends and allies. Mexico is certainly a friend. I think you could argue with the sense of proportion there. But look, the tariffs on Mexico and China aren't happening. The request by Trump, the demand by Trump for better border control was a perfectly reasonable one. And if, in the end, the roughhouse tactic brought about the kind of border control measures which should have been in place already, maybe, as I said, that's not the world's worst thing.
And on Ukraine, I mean, do you get the impression, because we've had quite a spectrum of opinion on it. I thought that Boris Johnson was quite considered in his column on the Mail at the weekend, basically saying, hang on a minute, you know, the so-called global liberal elites are throwing their toys out of the pram here. He is not selling out Ukraine to Putin. Do you agree with that analysis? Because many are very suspicious of this 1.5 hour phone call, and also this idea that the Russians deserve a, quote, reasonable settlement. Why do invaders deserve to be treated reasonably at all?
Well, I agree. What Putin did was simply evil. Simply evil. I mean, he's rained down heavy weaponry indiscriminately on Ukrainian civilians. He's devastated large sections of the country. Ukraine was never any threat to Russia. So this is a vicious dictatorship, and what's happened is an abomination. That said, we live in the real world. It is going to be very difficult for the Ukrainians to push the Russians out of every last inch of their territory, particularly without much more help than anyone has been prepared to give them thus far. The important thing, I think, is not so much to recriminate about the past, but to secure the future. And if any ceasefire and peace deal does put serious Western forces in Ukraine so that Russia can never again attack Ukraine with impunity, Ukraine can then build a decent, sovereign, independent future for itself. Maybe in the real world, that's as good as we can hope for.
But what about the argument that if Putin is in any way allowed to claim this as a victory, then it does leave former Soviet states in jeopardy? This idea that he could invade again, you know, if you're in Estonia right now, you might be nervous.
If Ukraine is left with a serious Anglo-French military presence, serious countries with serious armed forces that will fight if attacked, I think that would be quite an acceptable outcome in the real world in which we live.
What did you make of the J.D. Vance Munich speech? Because on one hand, maybe he does have a point. Let's just have a look at the precise words. The threat that I worry about most, the threat that I worry the most about vis-à-vis Europe is not Russia, it's not China, it's not any other external factor. What I worry about is the threat from within, the retreat of Europe from some of its most fundamental values, values shared with the United States of America. I mean, on one hand, I think we can appreciate what he's saying. He was particularly critical of Britain, where he says that free speech has been suppressed. But equally, is it a good idea to have the deputy leader of the free world, as it's known, attacking Western allies on a global stage?
I think he was telling Western allies a few necessary home truths. I mean, the truth is that in Europe, and indeed in Britain, people are scared of voters. People are scared of free speech. The fact that political parties with significant followings were excluded from this conference. The fact that here in Britain, people are being persecuted by the police for praying silently in the street. The fact that Scotland wanted to criminalise conversations around the family dinner table. I mean, this is crazy. It's absolutely crazy. I mean, our societies are built on democratic freedoms where people are able to vote for the candidates they wish to elect, built on free speech, built on the rule of law, not lawyers. And these are under massive attack. I mean, you know, let's look at the last British Conservative government. The government was frustrated at every turn by activist civil servants, by activist judges. It lacked the guts to actually change the relevant laws, forgetting that in the end, Parliament is sovereign. And I think there are more and more people in democracies like ours who want democracy to work better, and that means the elected representatives have got to be able to implement the policies upon which they are elected. And all too often in our countries right now, that is frustrated by increasingly out-of-touch elites. Now, whatever you think of Trump, he is a gale of fresh air in the system. He is the disruption that our systems need right now because he is determined to bulldoze through against politically correct objections.
Now, he actually called Boris Johnson's Britain's Trump. We all know how that turned out. Who do we think is Britain's Trump now on the right? Is it Kemi Badenoch or is it Nigel Farage, Mr Abbott?
Well, look, I happen to know both. I have a lot of respect for both. I want, in a sense, all good Conservatives to succeed. And we're a long way off from the next election in Britain. I think the important thing for all good Conservatives, whichever political party they might be in, is to develop an effective critique of a really bad government and then to develop attractive plans for how they would build a better Britain.
But don't you think they need to perhaps combine forces? We'll have a strange situation, won't we, when if we're still in this electorate being split a third, Reform, Tories and Labour, to have 2/3 on the right, 1/3 on the left, but the vote split on the right so that the left get in again for another 4 years. At some point, as a righty, don't you think Reform and the Tories need to get together?
I think the important thing right now, because let's face it, we're 4 years away from the next election, the important thing right now is to develop an effective critique of a pretty poor government and to develop attractive plans for the future. I think the important thing right now is to focus on what really matters rather than engage in endless tactical debate. Now, I think back to the 2019 election where Nigel Farage effectively did do a deal that allowed Boris Johnson to win a smashing victory. Unfortunately, it was not adequately capitalised upon. So back then. Nigel certainly showed, I think, great magnanimity. I think back to the late 1990s in Australia when the Howard government was challenged by an outbreak on the discontented right, if you like. And John Howard dealt with Pauline Hanson and the One Nation Party back then, not by criticising Pauline Hanson, not by criticising people who were inclined to vote for One Nation, but by focusing on the issues that were worrying people and coming up with sensible policies to deal with them.
The only conclusion I could draw from that is that if Nigel Farage helped out the Tories last time round, it might be for the Tories to help out Nigel Farage next time round, Mr Abbott, but we need to leave it there. Don't know what you think about that, but maybe that could be how a deal is struck.
Look, the Conservative Party is the oldest and the most successful political party in the history of the West, and I think there's a lot of life left in the Conservative Party.